Hey there friendos, Newbornkilik here, welcoming you back to another awesome Zelda-related video. Now today, I wanted to take a look at alternate realities in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Mostly taking a look at the Hyrulian Civil War. We're going to be taking a look at some alternate timelines that may have very well branched off from that point. Namely, what would have happened if either the Goron or the Zora had won the Hyrulian Civil War and they, the three races had united under them, or depending on how kind they were feeling, maybe not united at all and led to a mass genocide. I'm not saying that's what I think would happen, but it is a possibility. So first, I guess we should kind of discuss why the Hylians actually won the Hyrulian Civil War in the first place. Basically, the Hyrulian Civil War, if you don't know, was the battle for the Sacred Realm. Eventually, at some point in the history of Hyrule, word got out that there were three magical triangles, and everyone wanted to get their hands on it, so people fought for them. When you think about the Gorons and the Zoras, they have a lot of advantages over what are essentially just humans. The Hylians do, in some instances, have access to magic. However, modern-day Hylians definitely do not, and given that the Hyrulian Civil War was just before the event of Ocarina of Time, it's not very absurd to assume that the magic had basically dried up out of these Hylians at this point. So my best guess as to why the Hylians actually won the Hyrulean Civil War is most likely because of the introduction of the Interlopers. For those of you that don't know, the Interlopers are a group of invaders that basically resemble Dark Link. That's a whole nother theory for a whole nother time as to why that might be, but not too much before the end of the Hyrulean Civil War, the Interlopers were actually introduced into this. Now, the Interlopers are, in Twilight Princess, is kind of when they really were brought to the limelight. In a cutscene, they were actually shown to be very powerful, and they were eventually sealed away by the three light spirits sent by the golden goddesses at the time. Bear in mind, all of this did take place right before the events of Ocarina of Time. So, strange beings come by, and all of a sudden, these three races who they were in the running, those were the only three races. They didn't have any idea about any interlopers, none of these interstellar or any, beings from beyond the beyond really were in the running for any of this. So at that point, it's my assumption that they kind of wisened up to the situation, and if they are not ready to fight, this other threat that seemingly came out of nowhere, they may no longer exist. As a side note, I have a feeling that maybe the Sheikah, if it were ever to come to it, may have been able to at least assist in the eradication of the Twilight beings, the interlopers, if you will, but the Hyrulean Civil War kind of wiped all the Sheikah out. Well, most of them. Oops! So again, we're still in guessing territory as to why this happened. I guess it's like a little mini theory, but the reason that they all united under one banner is basically, if you don't know, the royal family births Zelda. Now, Zelda, of course, has her name in the title, but on top of that is the mortal reincarnation of the goddess Hylia, one of the goddesses that helped defeat Demise at some point way in the back. So, given the fact that they actually had some kind of ties to the goddesses in Ocarina of Time, bear in mind, we're talking about an Ocarina of Time here, okay? That's the game we're looking at. We're pulling sources from other games, but mostly we're looking in Ocarina of Time for this stuff. So, Ocarina of Time, Zelda will be birthed at some point, and she will have a tie to the goddess. It makes sense to me that if you have one of the three races that basically has the trump card of being tied to the goddesses, you're probably going to, let's just go ahead and play second fiddle to them. They can take the top rung. We'll be right here. That's second fiddle's not bad, especially when you're talking about someone who literally just saved your hide, most likely. You're not really going to challenge the goddesses at that point. But again, that part is all speculation and only really important for knowing what the Hyrulean Civil War is, but hopefully you did kind of gather some information on that. So first we're going to take a look at what if the Zora had actually won the war, some of the ways they may have been able to do it relatively easily, and some of the aftermath of that. So first off, how would they have won the war? Well, that's pretty simple, actually. All of the water in Hyrule comes from Zora's domain and eventually runs down into Lake Hylia. So you cut off their water supply, they're gonna be forced to take an action. Now, if you take a look at Zora's domain, it is an exceedingly defensible location. There's a choke point. There's not really a lot of space to, like move an army through it. It's very narrow corridors. They basically have to terraform the land in order to make any kind of advance onto the Zora. So attacking up to the Zora would be very difficult, and if the Zora were smart, they'd probably just take up a defensive position, cut off the water supply, and play the war of attrition. Eventually, the Hyrulians would give up. Gorons maybe not so much. I don't even know if Gorons... Do Gorons drink water? They say they get all their nutrition from rocks. So now that we know how the Zora could, in fact, quite easily win the war, in my opinion, what would happen? What would be different? So at this point, everything's peaceful. There is a section of dialogue that Ruto has that kind of hints at maybe, this is a big maybe, some tension between the races and, just a little bit. Ruto basically promises to marry you, and at some point after that says, "Don't tell my father." Now, there are two ways you could interpret this. You could either interpret this as, well, there's a little bit of racism going on, and the father definitely does not want her daughter marrying one of those landlubbers. Or alternately, it's just a kid. You don't get married at what, like 12? So both of those are very valid. Again, we're gonna branch off a little bit. Assuming there is some sort of ill content between the two races, it's very possible that this may have happened either before the war or during the war. If the Zora King, Mr. Moeeps himself, does not like you, well, there's a good chance you're probably not going to have your head for very long. Now, there are a lot of consequences to killing the Hylians. Naturally, you would have no more Zelda, no more reincarnation of the goddess Hylia, and at some point, of course, it would find a way. Now, there's nothing even saying that the Golden Goddesses would let this happen, given that you would essentially be waging war on the goddesses themselves. Nothing saying that the Golden Goddesses, Din, Nehru, and Pharaoh would even let this happen. So, assuming that they were, trying to execute people and they got to the royal family, at some point, they would either have to be really smart with who they were executing, or be better people. Or the goddesses would probably lay the smackdown on them, to be completely honest with you. That's your tie to the goddesses, mortals. Don't mess it up. Or they'll just kill everyone and, that tie will come back and, well, whenever it's convenient for the next game, to be completely honest with you. So then there's also the other side, maybe they would have been a better leader. If the Zora did decide to be peaceful with their victory, not a whole lot would really change, most likely. The heart of Hyrule would probably be Zora's domain. The leaders do tend to have, the most developed cities and everything. But there's really not a lot of room for expansion. The main shopping area and everything would probably still be Castletown, but the capital would be moved to Zora's domain, most likely. After all, the capital does tend to harbor the leaders. Just makes sense. At the end of the day, if the Zora did decide to be, more peaceful, there wouldn't be a whole lot different. But how would this have affected the events of Ocarina of Time? Well, it's very deeply rooted that Link is the hero of time, so that wouldn't have changed. Zelda, assuming again that the Zora were peaceful and kind rulers, would be fine. Zelda would still be there, you'd still be able to go talk to her. In fact, most of the game would be roughly the same. The only difference is, who would Ganon have tried to coerce into doing his dirty work, basically? He still would need to get the spiritual stones. My best guess would be that he would still probably try to side with the King of Hyrule, given the fact that Jabu Jabu was in fact infected with the parasite a little bit more stealthily than he kind of tried to strong-arm the Gorons into getting their spiritual stone. It would make sense that they wouldn't have really known to call for help. So the fact that they would, in essence, have more, manpower to fight off Ganondorf at this point, they probably wouldn't even know what was going on until the parasite had taken over too much of Jabu Jabu, which would have definitely complicated things. Though the fact still remains that Princess Ruto would have gone missing in the same way that she did in the vanilla version of the game. So, in theory, other than, a couple locations being different, the capital being different, probably not a whole lot that would be different. The Zora don't really ever act vindictive, so I believe that they would probably be pretty good rulers. Okay, so now, what if the Goron had won the war? The Goron are a totally different beast from the Zora, right? They're much stronger, much beefier, much tankier, and they live on Death Mountain. A place, again, almost impossible to attack. you're attacking up a mountain. That's not going to be easy, which leads us quite nicely into how would the Goron win the Hyrulian Civil War. Well, it wouldn't be nearly as easy for them as it would for the Zora. After all, as we discussed, the Zora do have all of the water supply of Hyrule to work with, so easily just winning that war of attrition, but the Goron kind of would have to take a more direct approach. So when you think about Ocarina of Time, we don't really have a whole lot to work on as far as what the Goron can do, how they battle, and, just their overall battle style, like how they might take out the enemies here. So, one, we know that they would be able to roll, okay? They'd be able to roll and do very, very significant damage to any troops that they would basically roll directly over. We can see from Majora's Mask that their punches are quite strong, and they basically have armor all over their backs when they assume a defensive position, face down, ironically. Again, we're pulling from Majora's Mask because we don't really have a whole lot in Ocarina of Time to work with, but it can also be assumed that the Goron use weaponry. Now, I would guess all of the races use weaponry, but the Gorons actually have two smiths in their city. There is the big Goron and the smaller one that's still a very large, large for a Goron, but he can at least live inside Goron City, whereas the big Goron, where you get the big Goron sword, actually has to live up on Death Mountain. So I would imagine that Goron right there is their trump card for attacking. He is a massive, colossal titan of a Goron. Can you imagine that thing rolling through a city? Never mind actually attacking, like trying to damage things with his hands or any kind of large weaponry that he might have. Just rolling through a city. He could easily wipe out, I would say, a quarter of Castletown just with one roll. But what's that? You're not surrendering? Well, I guess we'll go back through again, won't we? Easy. Okay, easy wins with Mr. Big Goron here. And on top of that, we have these incredibly durable Gorons all run around with weapons. Again, given the fact that there are two smiths in the area, we can basically assume that they could at least be trained with weaponry. We also know that Darunia plans to use the Magneton Hammer, or that the ancestors at least use the Magneton Hammer. Even if there's no training, the amount of brute force that these Gorons could put out with just a single slash would just cleave any Hylian in half. All of the art for Daruk does show him using one of his signature Goron swords, not so much a slicing sword as a crushing sword. It's gonna do some serious damage. I'm not liking the chances of really anybody being able to get around that blade. And again, you have one big Goron that can do a lot of damage, and then you have the big Goron that lives on top of Death Mountain. I'm just saying, the Gorons could have it easily. Of course, they are a very honor-bound race, which may actually kind of hinder their victory in some way. After all, they didn't really fight back against Ganondorf. If you need a refresher course, the Gorons actually had their food supply blocked off by a giant rock, essentially. So yeah, they may be a little bit of a pushover, but if they really, really wanted to win the war, easily could have taken care of it. No problem. Now, of course, bear in mind, these are the Gorons that we see now. The Gorons back in the day may have been different, but this is what we have to work with. Given that the Hyrulian Civil War was somewhat recently, at least based off the events of Ocarina of Time, we can assume that at least some of these Gorons were around. Again, if there was one thing to maybe be skeptical about, it would be the fact that they would have this specific set of Gorons, as even though it is somewhat recent to Ocarina of Time, it still could have been a long time in the past, but still, as a general rule, the Gorons easily would have been able to win the war. No problem, were it not for the potential interference from the interlopers, of course, and the total power move of having essentially a tie to the goddess based on the royal family, but that's beside the point. So, what would have changed inside the game? Well, Ganondorf would not have been able to get away with all his nonsense, okay? The moment Ganondorf decided to try and strong-arm the Gorons, if they're the leaders, there would have been war, okay? Darunia was absolutely not happy, and he would not watch his people starve while Ganondorf just gets to go around, having fun. Oh, let's make friends with the king of Hyrule. No, there would have been a second war, okay? And it would have been against the Gerudo and that man. So at that point, it really comes down to how powerful was Ganondorf at this point. We don't really know. We know that he can apparently either move this large rock or materialize it in some way, so he must be very powerful. It's very possible that things may have gone very south. Again, a lot of this is speculation, but if I were the leader, the absolute leader of the land, and you came in and demanded my treasure, and then blocked off my food supply, yeah, I would eliminate that man. But anyway, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. It does help me out an awful lot. If you did enjoy the video, please do consider leaving it a like. Consider checking out the gameplay channel. We have a lot of fun over there. And if you happen to be a patron as well, then check out the behind the scenes for this episode live on Patreon right now. Anyway, I'm Newbornkilik, and I will see you in the next one. I'm out.